The One and Only Cynthia Jane Thornton by Claudia Mills. Copyright 1986. Chapter 9. The whooshing roar of the vacuum cleaner died abruptly. Lucy had done her vacuuming. Cynthia waited to see what her sister would do next. Whenever Cynthia finished first, she took the vacuum cleaner in to Lucy. It was courteous to help the straggler. But instead, Lucy left the machine in the hall outside Cynthia's closed door. When Cynthia went out to get it, Lucy's door was closed too. Fine. However mad Lucy was, Cynthia was even madder. Making fun of Elsie was nothing compared to Lucy's crime of writing Elsie in the first place. But it was hard to believe that just 3 weeks ago they had been running off together for breakfast at Burgerland, laughing so hard that their stomachs ached. "Lucy's straightening up some of her mess this morning," Mrs. Thornton announced cheerfully, when Cynthia had completed her chores and dragged the vacuum cleaner back downstairs. "Maybe you could help her a little bit. Light the way and cheer her on." Mrs. Thornton gave Cynthia a conspiratorial smile. Cynthia shrugged. "What's so terrible about a messy room if that's how Lucy likes it? Lucy never seems to have any trouble finding anything." "A messy room attracts bugs," Mrs. Thornton said, her smile fading. Cynthia had heard the bug's explanation before, but she had never been convinced. How can a bug outside know that Lucy's room is messy inside? That was expecting the bugs to have ESP practically. Mrs. Thornton gave an exasperated cluck and turned back to grading papers. A sea of homework assignments was spread out around her on the dining room table. Somewhat contrite for answering back, Cynthia offered to help. Correcting other people's homework had to be as much fun as moping all by herself. "How about these spelling workbooks?" Mrs. Thornton suggested, seeming relieved at her offer. "Here's the teacher's manual for you to check them against. Don't put a grade, just circle the wrong answers in red." It seemed easy enough, though Cynthia preferred assignments where she could use her mother's Mr. Squirrel rubber stamp kit. There were 5 different stamps giving Mr. Squirrel's rating of the homework. Excellent, 5 acorns was the best. A downcast Mr. Squirrel surveying a lone acorn was the worst. There weren't many 5 acorn workbooks this time. Almost everyone, including Michael Bailey, had spelled recommend with too many C's and not enough M's. Cynthia gave an approving pat to the final workbook and pushed the completed pile across the table to her mother. "Do you have any math papers I can do next?" Cynthia's mother hesitated for a split second. The math papers always went to Lucy, the family mathematician, but it took Mrs. Thornton only an instant to realize that of course that was unfair. "Here are some decimal quizzes with the master key." To make up for the fleeting unfairness, she added, "You can use the squirrel stamp if you want. Give 5 acorns for a perfect paper, 4 if they get one wrong." She handed Cynthia the stamp pad and went upstairs to collect Lucy's second bulging trash bag. Cynthia sifted through the pile of papers until she found Michael Bailey's. She wanted to do this while her mother wasn't around. She was counting on her mother not to double check her corrections. After all, no one checked up on Lucy when she graded papers. Out of 10 problems, Michael had missed one answer. Cynthia's hand strayed over to the 5 acorn stamp, but she made herself stick with 4. She pressed the stamp into the freshly inked green pad, then placed it firmly against the paper so the squirrel would print clearly and evenly. She picked up her mother's green ballpoint pen and thought for a moment before she wrote, in her most grown-up handwriting, "Michael, has anyone told you recently how much of a delight you are? You are by far the most interesting student I've ever taught. Thank you just for being you." Carefully she noted his grade, -1, in her mother's roll book. Hiding his paper at the bottom of the stack, she began working her way through the other 26 quizzes. By mid-morning, Lucy had finished cleaning her room. Her door was open, so Cynthia peeked in. However mad she was at someone, Cynthia couldn't go forever without speaking. "It looks nice," she said awkwardly, as Lucy flopped wearily on her neatly made bed. "Well, at least it won't attract bugs," Lucy said. Once the girls would have collapsed into helpless spasms of giggles at this remark, but nothing seemed so funny any more. "I saw what we're having for lunch," Cynthia said. "It's okay, grilled cheese sandwiches." "I saw too, with pickles." Cynthia didn't apologize for anything. Neither did Lucy. But they went downstairs together and shared the comics in the newspaper, and the grown-ups probably thought everything was just fine. That afternoon Cynthia and Lucy went to the public library, as they did every Saturday. Cynthia worked on her mythology project the whole time, though she did make a conspicuous display of checking out 2 astronomy books. She had been afraid Lucy would drag her Elsie manuscript along with her, but apparently the friends always worked on their books together. In the evening, instead of watching TV with the rest of the family, Cynthia lay on her own bed reading Ozma of Oz. She had outgrown Oz books a few months ago, but there was nothing like an Oz book to pass the time when she was bored or unhappy. On Sunday, even crisper and clearer than Saturday had been, the Thorntons went to pick apples at an orchard 10 miles outside of town. The sky was a hard, bright enamel blue, softening toward the feathery edges. It was the kind of day that every year prompted their father to begin reciting a long poem about October's bright blue weather, of which he could never remember more than a stanza or two. Cynthia thought about writing a poem herself, but she hadn't written a single one since Lucy had told her about Elsie. She'd gotten as far as hunting for a rhyme for apples. Dapples was one of her favorite poetic sounding words, but she'd stored the rhyme in one corner of her mind and hadn't reached for her dog-eared pad. She didn't ask Lucy anything more about Elsie, and Lucy certainly didn't mention it. But Cynthia couldn't put it out of her mind, and she knew Lucy hadn't forgotten their quarrel either. Lucy had taken her pile of books and papers out of the tower room, and both girls avoided the tower room altogether, doing homework alone in their own rooms or playing games downstairs with the grown-ups. Sunday evening the whole family played in a Chinese checkers tournament, which Cynthia finally won by a hair. All's well that ends well, she thought. If only Lucy would give up writing her book, Cynthia would forgive her for ever having started. As they were leaving for school on Monday, she made the mistake of asking, in her ominous casual tone, "Do you have everything? Clothes for changing? Homework? Elsie?" She hoped Lucy would say, "Elsie? Oh, that thing. Valerie and I decided you were right, that it was silly and stupid, so I threw it away." "Yes," Lucy said, and Cynthia hated her again. Taking heart from her fun afternoon with Joanne on Friday, Cynthia joined Meg and Joanne on the playground. Meg, busy recounting how many times she had thrown up and what color the throw up had been, forgot to roll her eyes at Cynthia's arrival. For what it was worth, the three of them were friends again. But Cynthia had decided she'd rather spend afternoons alone at the public library than talking about baseball, throw up, or underwear. At lunchtime every day, Cynthia watched Lucy and Valerie across the cafeteria. Lucy's fair head and Valerie's dark one were bent industriously over their writing. In the evening she tried to steal a peek at Elsie, but Lucy apparently had gone to some lengths to hide it. Wednesday afternoon, while waiting for Lucy to finish changing in the bathroom stall at Burgerland, Cynthia's curiosity reached a peak. "Did you have fun at Valerie's?" "Uh-huh," came the answer from the stall. "Did you have fun with Meg and Joanne?" Cynthia still hadn't told Lucy that she used her free time at the library instead. "Uh-huh. What did you and Valerie do today?" "Things." This time Lucy was dodging the question. "Things like Elsie?" No answer. "How is old Elsie? What chapter are you up to, anyway?" Still no response. "You must be almost done by now. You haven't told me about Valerie's little deaf girl, the one who lives in Paris. What's her name? Is she as fascinating as Elsie?" "Elsie was just so scintillating. Of course, Valerie's not really what you'd call a scintillating person. She's more of a dull, boring, mousy person, wouldn't you say?" Lucy burst out of her stall. "You leave Valerie out of this," she shouted. "Valerie's my best friend. I wish she was my sister and not you." The words stung Cynthia so deeply that all she could do was struggle to think of something equally terrible to say back. But she couldn't think of anything terrible enough. Through the past few weeks, through Elsie and everything, she had never wished Lucy wasn't her sister. She couldn't imagine wanting Meg or Joanne to be her sister instead. If she didn't have Lucy, then she didn't have anybody. Lucy had been her sister and her best friend, and now she was neither. I'm not your sister, Cynthia said, her voice low and trembling. We may have the same parents and live in the same house and wear the same clothes, but that doesn't make us sisters. Not real sisters. Not sisters at all. Without another word, Cynthia marched out of the bathroom door. Pale and furious, Lucy scrambled after her, stuffing clothes into her knapsack with any which way. Neither one said a thing the rest of the way home. They didn't need to take an oath in blood to stop speaking. There was nothing left for them to say. Girls, Mrs. Thornton said, still in her school clothes, greeted them at the door. Did you have a good day? Both nodded stiffly, but their flushed, strained faces gave them away. What's wrong? Mrs. Thornton looked at them more closely. What happened to Lucy's skirt? Cynthia caught in her breath. The brown skirt Lucy had been wearing when she left the house that morning was crammed into her knapsack with the red sweater she had just changed out of at Burgerland. In the heat of their argument, Lucy had forgotten to finish changing, and both girls had been too angry to notice. From the waist up, Lucy was dressed like Cynthia, in a yellow polka-dot blouse. From the waist down, she still wore the smuggled red pants. Lucy didn't know what to say. Cynthia answered for her. She spilled something on it. But you weren't wearing your red pants this morning. Did they send you home from school to get them? No, not exactly. Being a teacher, their mother knew that students were never sent home unless their parents had been called. So where did you get them? Lucy looked pleadingly at Cynthia again. We had them with us, Cynthia explained. Sometimes we bring other clothes with us and change part way. She tried to make it sound like a natural, common practice. Mrs. Thornton looked dumbfounded. Why on earth would you do something like that? This was the hard part. We don't really like dressing the same anymore. The other kids, nobody dresses alike. People say things, laugh at us, sort of. Their mother, who had been herding them into the living room as they talked, dropped down onto the couch. She motioned for them to sit down beside her. Cynthia suddenly had the horrible feeling that her mother might cry. They don't laugh a lot, just a little bit, Lucy added to reassure her. Why didn't you tell me? Why hadn't they told her? We thought you'd mind, Cynthia said. You thought I'd mind? It took a moment for the idea to register. Why would I mind? Because of fairness and all. You always want everything to be fair. Mrs. Thornton didn't say anything at first. She looked over at the mantel where 4 years of their school pictures in paired frames stood in a row. In every pair they were dressed exactly the same. Even identical barrettes, a silver bar, a blue butterfly, held back their hair. It was only you girls I was thinking of, she said finally. I never wanted either of you to grow up thinking we had loved the other one more. Did I ever tell you about me and Anne? Your Aunt Anne was a sickly child, always with a stomach ache or a sore throat. And with Anne, a stomach ache inevitably meant the flu, and a sore throat always turned out to be strep. I guess I should have felt sorry for her, but it seemed as if Anne positively thrived on all the attention. And how my parents catered to her. Don't bother Anne, she's resting. Run and get Anne's crayons, she's tired. If we went to a movie, they'd ask Anne what she'd like to see. Did Anne want popcorn? What kind of candy did Anne want? I ate all the black jelly beans until I was in my teens, because Anne didn't like the black ones. But do you know what? Mrs. Thornton lowered her voice as if she were revealing a deep, hushed secret. I don't like the black ones either. She laughed then, and shakily Cynthia and Lucy joined in. It wasn't even funny, but they all laughed anyway, and before they knew it they were laughing in the way Cynthia and Lucy used to laugh when they had to run upstairs and bury their faces in pillows. So, girls, their mother said, serious again, when they had wiped the laughter from their streaming eyes, I only wanted you both to know that you're equally precious to your father and me. She smiled ruefully. I just wanted you both to have an equal pick at the pink and orange jelly beans. But maybe I went about it in the wrong way. Maybe equal doesn't have to mean exactly the same. But really, you girls are old enough now to decide what you want to wear. There's no reason why you should have to dress alike if you don't want to. Is that what you were arguing about? Sort of, Cynthia said. Lucy nodded. Mrs. Thornton gave them each a hug. So, go upstairs and finish changing. Wear whatever you want. Lucy and Cynthia looked at each other. No more changing clothes in Burgerland. No more lies about their friends. They didn't mean to, but the corners of their mouths pulled into smiles, first small and uncertain, then broad and beaming, so big they hurt. And Cynthia knew that Lucy forgave her for what she had said at Burgerland, and she forgave Lucy too. They were halfway out the door when Mrs. Thornton called after them. Cynthia, before you go, I'd like to talk to you for just another minute, please. Alone. Cynthia shot a puzzled look at Lucy and came back to sit down on the couch. Cynthia, when I was handing back the decimal quizzes on Monday, I noticed an odd thing. One quiz had a comment written on it, a comment from me, and I didn't write any comments. Do you know what I'm talking about? Cynthia swallowed. Was it Michael Bailey's? A delight? Michael? The most interesting student I've ever taught? I think he's interesting, Cynthia said defensively. Because he's disruptive? Because he constantly misbehaves? He's different, that's all. He's unique. He's that all right. But Cynthia, let me tell you something. Everybody's unique. All my students are, the good ones as well as the bad ones. Everybody's different. Some are more different than others, Cynthia persisted, like Michael. And you? It was certainly what Cynthia thought. And me, she said, trying to sound offhand and modest. It wasn't too conceited to say something that was just a fact, or used to be a fact. She remembered Elsie again, and a lump rose in her throat. But Elsie wasn't even a good book. She had to remember that. Lucy and Valerie were just writing books for fun, to pass the time. They weren't real writers, like Cynthia and Melissa. The funny thing, Mrs. Thornton said, is that I handed the paper back to him just the way you wrote it. I figured I had tried everything else. And ever since, there's been a marked improvement. Michael's been much more pleasant and cooperative. So I guess I should be giving you a medal, not a scolding. But Cynthia, you don't have to try so hard to be unique. You already are. And Lucy's unique too? Of course. Cynthia gave up. Her mother didn't understand. By unique, Cynthia meant unique in all the world. No, make that unique in all the universe. Chapter 10. Cynthia slipped a brand new cartridge of deep blue ink into her pen. Unfortunately, in the process, a good bit of ink dribbled onto her math book. Page 89 looked as if a thick wedge of blueberry pie had been squashed on top of it. Cynthia still had such accidents from time to time with her cartridge pen, but writing with it made her feel like a true poet. Shakespeare had probably used a cartridge pen to write his sonnets, one with a long feathery plume at the end of it. She wiped more ink off her fingers with a wadded up Kleenex and tested the pen on a scrap of paper. The line she drew was smooth and beautiful. Taking a borrowed piece of her mother's cream-colored stationery, she looked one more time at her best poem ever before she copied it. Dandelions. Little fluffy buttons of gold adorn the meadows green with grass. And yet these charming fairy pillows are enemies of all who pass. They smile at one with a smile of sunshine, and when they start to fade away, little wisps of gossamer are borne by the breeze to bloom another day. They seem to know they're not befriended, and that their broken reputation can never be mended. But in spite of this, they show no hate of that wretched thing that we call fate. No doubt about it, it was wonderful. Better even than In the Fog. The visiting author would gasp when she read it. It had two metaphors for dandelions, fluffy buttons and fairy pillows. It had three of Cynthia's favorite poetic words, adorn, wisps, and gossamer. It had a moral lesson to teach, cheerfulness in the face of adversity, love returned for hate. But it was the last phrase that took Cynthia's breath away. That wretched thing that we call fate. Slowly she copied it, careful not to blot or smear. At the bottom she signed her name, Cynthia Jane Thornton, age 10. 10, she imagined the author exclaiming. Can the child be only 10? She checked it for mistakes, but couldn't find any. That wretched thing that we call fate, she whispered once more, and felt the same thrill she felt every time she said it to herself. All done? Mrs. Solomon asked, stopping by her desk to collect it. Cynthia nodded, and Mrs. Solomon tucked it into the same folder that held Melissa's best poem and Andy's. The three of them were the only ones whose poems were going to be given to Ellen Ketterson for comments, since they were the three best writers in the class. And of those three, well, Melissa's poems were very good too. Still, that wretched thing that we call fate was hard to beat. In 2 more days the author would be reading them aloud in front of everybody, saying which ones were the best. Maybe it was too bad after all that Mr. Taylor hadn't sent in part of Elsie. If Lucy could hear a real author's opinion of Elsie, she might put a stop to her book writing for good. "But why London, my dear? Have you ever been to London? You haven't? Well, then, may I suggest—" But Cynthia wasn't going to hound Lucy about Elsie any more. All day Friday Cynthia made up more wonderful things Ellen Ketterson could say to her, and that night as she lay in bed getting ready to drift off to sleep, she heard them once more in her mind. In her favorite imagining, Miss Ketterson told her that Dandelions should be published in a magazine. The author herself would take charge of sending it in, and 2 weeks later it would appear in print. Other imaginings featured the words genius and rare and wonderful gift. She woke up several times during the night and checked to see if it was morning yet. When it finally was, she was out of bed with her chores done before it was light. Then she surveyed her closet for the right poetic-looking clothes to wear, clothes she could pick out for herself alone, with no matching sets laid out for Lucy. Her unicorn dress would be perfect. It was Mrs. Thornton's most successful venture into dressmaking, and Cynthia herself had chosen the material, with scenes of white unicorns drinking from an enchanted pool in a cool green forest, and she'd asked her mother to put a green ribbon in her hair. The talk was at 11. Cynthia and Lucy left the house at 10:30 to get good seats. Now that the sisters didn't have to go everywhere together, Cynthia had hoped Lucy might decide to stay at home. But Valerie wanted to go, so naturally Lucy was going too. And Cynthia had to admit it was nice to have someone to walk with. Being silly with Lucy took her mind off the fateful sentence Ellen Ketterson was going to deliver. At the library they had to wait outside until Ellen Ketterson had finished with grades 1 through 3. In the gathering crowd, Cynthia caught a glimpse of Melissa. She waved guardedly, enough to be polite, but not enough to encourage Melissa to sit with her. It might be fun to have a friend to sit with the way Lucy did, someone who would share her excitement, but not today, when the judgment was to be pronounced. Cynthia imagined a deep-voiced announcer posing the solemn question, "Ellen Ketterson, who here in this multitude is truly a writer?" And how could it not be Cynthia, who loved writing so much, author of In the Fog, Dandelions, and haiku scribbled on Kleenex, on math quizzes, on the backs of envelopes? The library doors swung open. Cynthia could see Ellen Ketterson sitting in a low rocking chair over in the children's room. She looked like the picture on one of her book jackets, a pleasant middle-aged woman with dark hair drawn back from her face in a soft bun. A stack of papers lay in her lap. For all Cynthia knew, the paper on top was Dandelions by Cynthia Jane Thornton, age 10. Cynthia was too agitated to sit with the other children, cross-legged on the floor in front of the rocker. She wanted to sit where no one could see her face when Dandelions was discussed. So she crept to the back of the audience and crouched down behind a row of bookcases. She couldn't see the speaker from her hiding place, but she'd be able to hear every word. Miss Haynes greeted the children and parents and gave a brief introduction. Then Cynthia heard Ellen Ketterson's low, rich voice. No one could have described Cynthia's voice as low and rich. It was definitely high and breathless. But maybe Ellen Ketterson's voice had sounded high and breathless too when she was 10. For the first few minutes Ellen Ketterson told how she came to be a writer. She said she had to become a writer because she wasn't good at anything else. Her spelling was abysmal, and to this day she couldn't do long division without a calculator. "Just like me," Cynthia whispered. She remembered her last year's B in spelling with pride. And she certainly wasn't good at long division the way Lucy was, even if she was an A student in math, too. Ellen Ketterson had written plays in grade school, just like Cynthia's mythology plays. In high school, she had been a feature writer on the school paper, which Cynthia already planned to do. She had majored in English in college and then gone on to work as a librarian. That part Cynthia hadn't thought of doing, but if she had to have any job other than writing, It would be fun to have one in a library and know all the books through and through, the way Miss Haynes did. Then Ellen Ketterson turned to the student stories, saying she'd take questions at the end. Cynthia might pop out of hiding then, once Ellen Ketterson had identified her special talent. She had 1,000 questions. Maybe Ellen Ketterson would talk to her more in private after the others had gone. Maybe they would have lunch together, two writers sharing the secrets of their craft, exchanging story ideas, reading aloud bits of each other's work. Talking shop, Miss Haynes had called it. The first story Ellen Ketterson read was about a hamster who took a special pill that made him as smart as people. The story was funny, and a couple of lines made Ketterson laugh. When she was done, she asked the audience if they had liked it, and there was a chorus of yeses. Nobody said no, but Cynthia thought people would be too shy to say no, even if they hadn't thought it was very good. Then Ketterson said the author of the hamster story had a wonderful sense of humor, but that some things that happened to the hamster were too improbable for anyone to believe. Even if you write about a smart, talking hamster, she said, you can't make him do anything that a smart, talking hamster wouldn't do. The next piece read aloud was a poem about stars. It wasn't very good. It kept using the same rhymes over and over again, like star and far, and sometimes where there was supposed to be a rhyme, there wasn't any. Ellen Ketterson said it would have been a better poem if the author hadn't even tried to make it rhyme. A poem doesn't have to rhyme, she explained. She told the author to go out on the next clear night and look very hard at the stars, pretending that he was seeing them for the first time ever. This poem handles rhyme more successfully, Ellen Ketterson said, turning to the next entry. It's called Dandelions. She began to read. Little fluffy buttons of gold. Behind the bookcase, Cynthia froze. If the poem were funny, she could tell if Ketterson liked it by whether or not she laughed in the right places. But at least she had said the rhymes were good, and she read it beautifully, even better than Mrs. Solomon. But in spite of this they show no hate of that wretched thing that we call fate. Ketterson paused. Good use of rhyme here. A couple of lines are too long. They throw the rhythm off. Are born by the breeze to bloom another day. That's, let's see, 11 syllables. Most of the lines have just 8. There are some very nice images. Little fluffy buttons of gold. That's just how dandelions look, wouldn't you say? And the poem made me think of dandelions in a new way. After rooting so many out of my yard this past spring, I never thought I'd come to sympathize with their point of view. Ellen Ketterson laughed, a deep, full laugh that made you want to laugh again, made you want her to laugh again. If there's one single thing that makes a good poem, it's that it makes you see the world differently. The biggest problem, I'd say, is with the language. It's rather stilted, forced, adorn. That's a poetic word. It doesn't sound natural. And the last line is too grand for the context. It's melodramatic. Best to leave fate out of it. I have time for just one more poem, but it's a beauty. Here it is, Flight. Ellen Ketterson read Melissa's poem, and Cynthia could hear a soft sigh of appreciation go up from the assembled children after the last word had been read. That, Ellen Ketterson said, for what it is, within its self-imposed limits, is pretty darn close to perfect, I'd say. Cynthia didn't wait to hear Ketterson go in more detail about just why Melissa's poem was so wonderful. She forgot about waiting for Lucy, forgot everything except that she had to get away from there as fast as her bursting heart could carry her. Once outside, she began running as hard and fast as she could in the direction of the downtown stores. She didn't look to the right or left, she just ran until she reached the small square park across the street from the bookstore where she had bought her precious copy of Some Day You'll Write. Some day you'll write. Ha! She threw herself down on the leaf-covered grass and wept stormily. The lady in the bookstore had given her a special bag with violets on it. Violets for the poet. It had always been writing that had made her special, that had made her stand out from Lucy, stand out in the 5th grade class, stand out, sometimes she liked to imagine, in all of history. But Ellen Ketterson hadn't thought she stood out. Ellen Ketterson had thought Melissa was the special one, not Cynthia. The pale sprigged violets on the fancy bookstore bag belonged to Melissa, not to her. Melissa's the writer, not me, Cynthia repeated to herself, trying to drum the awful truth into her brain. Melissa's the special one, not me. But if Cynthia wasn't a writer, what was she? It seemed to her that if she wasn't a writer, she wasn't anything. When there were no more tears left, Cynthia began the long trudge back. She walked very slowly, counting her steps to see if 50 steps would take her to the next fire hydrant, 20 to a gaunt, leafless tree. Overnight, it seemed, the trees had turned bare. Everywhere fathers and mothers were out raking. People lugged tarps full of leaves down to the curb to heap upon the leaf mountain ranges already towering there. Yesterday the trees were crimson, orange, and gold. Today they are bare. Cynthia had counted out the haiku automatically, before she stopped herself. She wasn't going to be writing any more haiku. She was through with writing. When she reached home, Lucy was already there, waiting for her anxiously on the front porch steps. "Where were you? Where did you go?" "I just left, that's all." Lucy looked puzzled, but she hurried on, obviously bursting with her news. "But Cynthia, did you hear? Ellen Ketterson read your poem, your dandelion poem." "No, I left before that." She didn't want Lucy to know that she had heard everything the author had said about her poem, about Melissa's. "She read it right at the end. She thought it was wonderful." That wasn't how Cynthia remembered it. She said, let me see if I can remember. She said that was just the way dandelions really looked. And she said that your poem made her see dandelions in a new way, and that was the most important thing of all for a poem to do. I thought your poem was the best one she read." "Didn't she say anything bad about it?" "Not really. One line was too long, and she didn't like a couple of the words you picked, but basically she loved it." Cynthia looked hard at Lucy to see if her sister was deliberately twisting her report, but that was how Lucy seemed to remember Ketterson's comments. Cynthia felt as if she and Lucy had attended 2 different talks, maybe on 2 different planets. She felt a small stirring of hope deep in some hidden hurt place, but it didn't matter anyway. She would never write another poem again. Chapter 11. Cynthia left the house so early Sunday morning that even her parents, who never slept past sunrise, were still asleep. She left them a note on the kitchen table so they wouldn't worry. "I went for a walk, Cynthia." Or would that make them worry more? Why would somebody go for a walk at 6 in the morning unless there was something wrong, something she wanted to think about very hard all alone? Looking out the window as she quickly tugged on her clothes, she had thought morning was still a long way away. But once she closed the front door quietly behind her, she saw that it wasn't dark at all, really. The sky, through the bare tree branches, was soft and luminous, and toward the east the gray was stretched more thinly to show a pearly flush at the horizon. It made her think of some lines from a poem, not one of her own poems, but a poem by Emily Dickinson. "Will there really be a morning? Is there such a thing as day? Could I see it from the mountains, if I were as tall as they?" She turned the 4 short lines over in her mind, said them aloud, tasted them. They were so simple, nothing could be simpler, but they pierced her heart so directly that she knew they were true poetry, better than dandelions, better even than flight. She knew the poem wasn't just about waiting for morning, but about waiting for things to come clear, to make sense, to be all right again. She knew that the poet wanted morning to come more than anything, but didn't know if it would, didn't know if it could, maybe didn't even know what morning was anymore. By the time Cynthia reached the park, it was light enough that she could see to write. The grass was sodden with dew, so she sat on one of the painted wrought iron benches. From her knapsack she took her clipboard, her pad of white lined paper, her most thoroughly chewed pencil, and then she began writing as fast as her hand could fly across the paper. It started out as a letter to an imaginary friend she used to have back in 3rd grade when for one whole month nobody at school had liked her. Sedimentary sulfur, named after the grandest word Cynthia had known at the time, had been her best and only friend, except for Lucy, of course, until finally one day Meg had picked her to play Chinese jump rope for no reason at all, and suddenly she had real friends again. She and Sedimentary had drifted apart after that, but Cynthia still wrote long letters to her sometimes, secret letters that she kept hidden in a shoebox in the back of her closet. "Dear Sedimentary," she began, "guess what? Nobody likes me again. Meg and Joanne don't like me, and I don't like them very much either. I've been horrible to Lucy. I don't even like me. Everything is awful. I'm not a writer any more. Everything that used to make me special went away. As she kept on writing, though, the letter stopped being a letter and turned into a story. It wasn't a story about Cynthia exactly, but about a girl named Cynthia who wanted to be a writer too. A lot of the same things happened to the character Cynthia that had happened to the real life Cynthia, but Cynthia the author changed some things around to make the story better. It would be too long if she put in everything, especially all the terrible things. So she started with one little bit of it, the day she captured Doug's underwear, to make Meg and Joanne like her, and then realized that it hadn't made them like her any better. It was a funny story, looking back on it, and Cynthia made it even funnier as she wrote. In real life she had stomped off when Meg commanded her to wear the underpants to school on her head, but Cynthia the author made Cynthia the character try them on for size. So when she ran off in the story she was still wearing them, too mad to realize it until she was at Burgerland. It was a sad story, too, and somehow making the funny parts funnier made the sad parts sadder. Cynthia had tears in her eyes when she put down her pencil, but they weren't the stormy tears she had cried the day before. They were the kind of tears she cried when Matthew died in Anne of Green Gables, or when, in A Little Princess, Sarah Crewe showed herself a princess through hunger and drudgery and friendlessness. The story had a sad ending, but the ending felt right. It felt true. When Cynthia read it over, she was so excited she jumped up from the bench and began to pace back and forth across the park. It was truly the best thing she had ever written. It might be the best thing anyone had ever written, except that she knew it wasn't. Flight was wonderful too, and the poem about mourning, and Anne of Green Gables, A Little Princess, even Ozma of Oz. But for some reason the thought, usually so chilling, that she was one writer among many, couldn't break her exhilaration. Let there be a million writers, each with a story to tell, a song to sing. None of the others could tell her story, not the way she could tell it. It wasn't being a writer that made her special. It was what she wrote and how she wrote it. Blue Underpants was as different from Elsie as Elsie was from Flight. Her mother had been right after all. Everyone's story was special. Everyone's story was unique. Each was a never heard before note in some great swelling music. How could Cynthia not be special? She had her own funny, sad, true stories that belonged to her alone, to the one and only Cynthia Jane Thornton. Cynthia read her story over again, calmer now, but with her heart still pounding. She wanted to show it to someone, someone like Ellen Ketterson, who would appreciate the funny, clever way the story was put together, and maybe give her suggestions for making it even better. What she really wanted was to show it to another writer who would also be a friend, a true friend like Valerie was to Lucy, a friend you could share things with, share the things that mattered to you most. She wanted to show it to Melissa. There was a phone booth across the street, with a battered phone book dangling from a chain. Cynthia looked line by line through the column of Hartmans until she found Melissa's number. She didn't know Melissa's father's first name, but she remembered vaguely that Melissa lived on Mulberry Street, 5 or 6 blocks from the Thorntons. She fished a quarter from the bottom of her knapsack. It was late enough now that she wouldn't wake anybody, even if the Hartmans weren't early risers like the Thorntons. So before she could lose her nerve, she dialed the 7 digits. Melissa answered the phone. "Hi, Melissa. This is Cynthia Thornton from school." "Oh, hi." Even though Cynthia hadn't been very friendly to Melissa on the class trip, or before, or since, Melissa sounded happy that she had called. "I was wondering, well, you know the big mythology project that's due in 2 weeks? I was wondering, well, I'm doing mine in plays. I'm writing a play for each different one. Anyway, I'm going to work on it this afternoon, and I thought maybe, would you like to bring yours over and work on it too?" "Plays would be great. I'm just doing mine as a big long poem, sort of weaving them all together. It's nothing that original." "But your poems are wonderful. Flight is the best poem I ever read." She remembered the Emily Dickinson poem about mourning. "By anyone our age." "Do you really think so? I always wish mine would be as good as yours." Melissa sounded as if she meant it too. "So can you come this afternoon?" "Sure. I'll meet you halfway at Burgerland, okay? Like at 2 o'clock? Oh, and I have this story I want to show you. If you have any new poems, bring them too." Cynthia gave a wriggle of happiness as she replaced the receiver on the hook. She could hardly wait to get home to tell everything to Lucy. Stories and poems crowded into her brain, fertile and overflowing. She wanted to sing them at the top of her lungs, to dance and sing all the way home, with an imaginary pair of blue underpants set triumphantly on her head, like a crown.